SkipHounds by William Doc Walls. Introduction. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Anonymous. During the winter of 1966-67, a total of 23 children nearly drowned in the Jackson Park Lagoon. A small marshy pond splattered in the shadow of Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry. According to Lara Beta Hospital spokesman, those children were able to survive because the icy cold water induced a state of frozen animation, slowing their bodily functions, thus avoiding the destruction of their vital organs. Doctors unanimously agreed that had any of them been underwater for 20 minutes or more, the outcome would certainly have been different. Some suspect that satanic bounty hunter SkipHounds were using this desolate lagoon to trap young children whose souls had secretly been pledged to Satan. A local activist preacher confronted their parents, one by one, but none dared admit they had made a pact with the devil. A Chicago Journal investigative reporter dubbed this infamous lagoon, the Southside Devil's Triangle. Prologue. Friday, January 13, 1967, 7 a.m. 12-year-old Frankie Myers awoke to the distressed roar of a frustrated snow thrower. He bounded from the bed, and rubbed his hazel eyes as he ran through the rickety third-floor haunt his mama rented from the old white man, who smelled like hard work. Frankie pressed his face against the frosty front room window pane. As far as his wide eyes could see, everything was bedecked in the whitest of white cloaks. The street and sidewalks had inauspiciously disappeared. The cars parked along the curb were engulfed up to their mounded roofs. They appeared to be sinking towards the center of the earth. Frankie had never seen anything like it. The crippling storm that hit while the city slept had dumped 24 inches of snow. It was the biggest blizzard in Chicago history. Strangely, not one weatherman had forecasted. Since the inclement weather had forced the closure of all Chicago public schools, Frankie, an outstanding student, would have the day off. His dark-skinned mama, a scantily paid day laborer, had to work, anyhow. He would be left to look after himself. No need to worry. Frankie was a big boy. Mama's big boy. Just as Mama was at the door ready to leave, Frankie hesitantly asked,
"May I go outside and play in the snow?"
Mama responded,
"I guess so."
And then she laid down the rules.
Dress warmly, see that you don't get frostbite, get home before the street lights come on, and whatever you do, be careful.
The door had nearly closed behind her when she urgently stuck her head and shoulders back in and forcefully added,
"Frankie, stay away from that Jackson Park Lagoon. Do you understand me? Stay away from that lagoon. Another child nearly drowned last week."
Was it on the news?
Don't question me. It happened. Stay away from that lagoon. You hear me?
Frankie had heard the neighborhood rumors about lagoon monsters doing bad things to children. But he didn't believe them. As he closely gave Mama a hug and a kiss goodbye, he said,
"I hear you."
Anxious to get outside, Frankie hurriedly washed most of his face. Mama had made him bathe the night before. He didn't waste time brushing his teeth. Instead, to freshen his breath, he chewed a piece of bazooka bubble gum. He blew bubbles as he dressed in his play clothes. Frankie put on his thrift store blue jeans, and pinned them at the waist to fit. He slipped a white coffee-stained jersey over a dickie, and covered them both with a girlish blue sweater. Rather than his knitted school gloves, he put on mix-match leather gloves. One brown, one black. He put a good pair of socks under a pair that had holes in them. He slipped into his PF Flyer sneakers and stuffed them, right then left, into his black rubber fireman boots. Frankie put on his green winter coat, the one with the busted zipper that had been repaired, and repaired so many times, it couldn't be repaired anymore. He fastened it tightly with safety pins. After donning his brown wool skullcap, Frankie dashed out of the door. The lucky bright red knitted scarf, tied around his face and neck, flopped in the wind like a kite tail, as he ran down all 3 flights of stairs, singing a parody.
"I'm off to see the blizzard. The most wonderful blizzard of all."
It was boring outside. Everywhere Frankie went it was the same old thing, just a bunch of people shoveling snow and fussing about the weather. He'd forgotten about the lagoon soon after Mama warned him to stay away. He didn't think about it again until he had seen all there was to see elsewhere. Since it wasn't even dark yet, and since Jackson Park wasn't so very far away, Frankie decided to go and investigate that lagoon. He was curious to know what this monster fuss was all about. Investigating an infamous child-eating lagoon might have seemed like a pretty good idea to an inquisitive 12-year-old, but it was, flat out dumb. It was about as dumb as touching a hot iron to see just how really hot it is. Frankie entered Jackson Park. Everything smelled so clean and fresh. The awesome snow completely blanketed the landscape. It rendered all of the park's interior roadways impassable. There was no traffic anywhere nearby. There were no loud car engines roaring, no car horns blowing, no radiator fans whirring. There was no sound, period. The park was as quiet as a cemetery. Instead of noise, there was a snow-muffled silence. The lack of sound was so complete and so overwhelming, it numbed Frankie's ears and made them ring. It was an ideal setting. A picture postcard perfect scene. Beautiful frosty trees on a crisp winter's eve, a young boy hiking solo, not another soul in sight. Frankie looked around. When he realized he was completely alone, he momentarily panicked. The last thing he wanted was to be eaten alive. He thought about turning around and going home, but he couldn't. The lagoon begged to be investigated, and he felt obligated. A bit leery at first, Frankie watched nervously in all directions at once. After a while, he bravely dismissed the terrifying tales of the lagoon's monstrous appetite for small children. Fascinated by the wondrous sight of snowflakes floating from the sky, Frankie squinted to follow their descent and watch them land, one by one. To create an impression of a winged angel, Frankie laid face up in the glistening new fallen snow and opened and closed his outstretched arms and legs, again and again. For the moment, it didn't matter that his oversized blue jeans, girlish sweater, mix-match gloves, and his lucky red scarf were all soaking wet. He was having too much fun to feel the cold. His frosty breath lingered in the chilled January air as he giggled and frolicked without a care. Despite his mama's firm vociferous warnings, Frankie trekked dangerously close to the edge of the frozen Jackson Park Lagoon. Apparently he was more enthralled with the snowfall than he was afraid of being swallowed whole. He watched the whispery snow briskly blow and indiscriminately settle in huge drifts. Even in the silvery cloud-covered late afternoon daylight, it was very difficult to tell where the wobbly shore would end and the icy lagoon would begin. But all was well. Frankie and Mother Nature were bonding. She shared her isolation and he amused her with his fascination. The two of them were destined to become one. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Somewhere along the way, the snowfall had ceased. Eventually, the streetlights hummed and struggled to illuminate. That was the signal for Frankie to end his peaceful excursion and return home. Satisfied that there was no monster to see, he turned around and started back. Oddly, at that very moment, the snowfall began again. At first, friendly snowflakes slowly trickled, straight down. Then, by the by, northerly gusts of hardy wind kicked up and hurled wicked sheets of blinding snow, which clobbered Frankie in the face. For a time he struggled headlong into the tenacious tempest. His brown wool skullcap only covered his head and ears. His lucky red scarf rested at his chin and only partially protected his face. So, he turned around and walked backwards to avoid the snow's pelting. Frankie proceeded with the storm at his back. He enjoyed watching the trail he forged in the virgin snow. Carelessly, he drifted onto the frozen lagoon's fragile surface. He was shocked when he found himself several feet from shore. Now, rather than smartly make his way back to safety, one prudent step at a time, Frankie panicked. He frantically tried to reach safety all at once. But, the soles of his black rubber fireman boots proved unable to grip the wet icy surface beneath the shallow layer of loose snow. Ominously, he slid closer and ever closer towards the middle of the deep, treacherous lagoon. Frankie quickly lost the battle to maintain his balance. His feet slipped on the wet, slick surface and wildly flew from beneath him. His wiry, 80-pound frame crashed hard onto the thin ice, causing it to flutter and quake. Rudely awakened, the water below seemed irate. It ferociously lashed out at Frankie. The water repeatedly revved up and crashed into the undersurface of the ice. First he heard two loud scraping noises. One short, one long. And then another. In combination it sounded as if the lagoon monster had called him by name.
Frankie Myers.
Certain he would fall through the ice, Frankie lay petrified on his side. He anticipated the very worst. Aloud, he timorously chanted a nursery rhyme taught to him the previous summer by his best pal, superstitious Stevie.
Today's a day like none before, I shall be changed forevermore. I shall not weep, I shall not cry, from this day till the day I die.
Seconds passed. Wouldn't you know it, he hadn't fallen through the ice after all. Maybe that chant was as magical as superstitious Stevie had claimed. Feeling lucky, like a cat with 8 lives left, Frankie carefully turned onto his stomach, got up on his hands and knees, and purposefully crawled toward safety. All the while he continued his powerful chant.
Today's a day like none before, I shall be changed forevermore. I shall not weep, I shall not cry, from the guests.
He stammered as he listened to a crack in the ice, which seemed to progress toward him in slow motion.
This day. Till the day I die.
He chanted faster.
Today's a day like none before, I shall be changed forevermore. I shall not weep, I shall not.
He hesitated to evaluate the winding, sundering sound. It was headed directly at him. He continued his chant, bravely emphasizing each and every word.
Cry, from this day till the day I die.
After an everlasting second, he heard a deafening boom. The ice that had supported him gave way. Frankie fell through. In an instant, he was up to his chest in water so brutally frigid, it stole his breath away. He unleashed a blood-curdling scream for help. Yet, there was no one near enough to hear it. The same fascinating isolation he had relished and enjoyed only moments before was now his cursed enemy. The ferocious cold water wrapped around Frankie's throat. He grappled frantically and struggled to reach the shore. Certain of victory, the water laughingly flogged about. The waterlogged young boy flapped his arms in vain, like a baby bird trying to fly. Suddenly, his gloved hands became entangled in the lucky red scarf that hung from his neck. The more he twisted his hands, the more they were tied. Try as he might, Frankie could no longer keep his bobbing head above water. He was unable to resist the clarion call of the wintry lagoon. Once and for all, he gasped for air. Then he sank, deeper and deeper. Frankie held his breath as he peered down into the icy deep. He was certain that he saw the infamous lagoon monster, poised and ready to devour him. He imagined the giant predator's prickly hand attached to his waist, dragging him below, faster and faster. For a split second Frankie wondered, what would superstitious Stevie do? As the last bit of oxygen painfully evaporated from his lungs, Frankie crossed his fingers. In a final act of desperation, he opened his mouth to scream for Mama. He'd always found comfort in that name. The water rushed in. There was no audible sound. In a gurgle, Frankie was gone. For a while, the violent lagoon thrashed about triumphantly, like the drunken unruly mob of Southside fans that celebrated after the White Sox won their first World Series. Once the thrashing subsided, the freezing water began to re-solidify over the spot where Frankie had fallen in. Somewhere far away, a trumpet sounded taps. Although unrelated, it was a fitting tribute to a good kid with a kind heart who was near the end of his life, much too soon. Once again, the snowfall ceased. All was deathly quiet. A morbid gloating silence stubbornly hovered over the darkened lagoon. That silence begrudgingly gave way to the sloshing sound of an old rusted plow truck, which sluggishly parted the snow, as majestically as Moses had parted the Red Sea. The sputtering vehicle made its way through the park. It slowed as it neared the recent break in the ice. Before the corroded truck could come to a complete stop, the lone occupant threw open the driver's side door. Without regard for his own safety, Jonathan Bailey, of the Secret Society of Satan, lunged out, long rope in hand. The Secret Society of Satan, commonly called the Society, is an affluent organization of wealthy devil worshippers. These agents of Lucifer were fully sanctioned and empowered to entice people to pledge their soul to the devil. These satanic intercessors would arrange for desperate people to receive money or other benefits, in exchange for their solemn promise to worship Satan and eternally live in hell. Some call it Hades. By any name, it's a god-forsaken inferno where forlorn residents vividly relive all of the worst moments of their lives. Over and over, and over again. Many pledges, who received benefits from the society under this arrangement, later had a change of heart. They reneged on their promise to faithfully worship Satan. No longer willing to surrender their souls to him, those flip-floppers became fugitives from the society. Seeking to be shielded from the devil, fugitives religiously recited a popular prayer to God. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Ultimately, the fugitive thing became troublesome. To combat this growing trend, the society recruited 6,000 faithful devil worshippers. They certified them and gave them the title SkipHounds. Like the Navy conditions its SEALs to achieve extraordinary feats under extreme circumstances, the society trains and conditions its SkipHounds. The society even teaches SkipHounds to master the principles of forensics and behavioral sciences. Once fully trained and developed into world-class trackers, SkipHounds are equipped with all of the earthly skill and instincts of Navajo scouts. SkipHounds are able to understand how modest events, past and present, might significantly affect the future. The average SkipHound can walk into a cathedral full of people and, within minutes, determine who came in first, who came in last, and who is most likely to be found dead with a toaster in their bathwater. Society-trained SkipHounds are nicknamed satanic bounty hunters by some, and called the devil's bill collectors by others. The society commissions them to track down ungrateful fugitives. In the early days, SkipHounds would weasel their way into the lives of fugitives and pal around with them. SkipHounds would wait patiently. When a fugitive they befriended died, they would then commandeer their soul and pilot them to hell. Over a period of time, SkipHounds evolved. They became so proficient they didn't have to wait until a fugitive died to claim their soul. SkipHounds perfected the art of sucking the souls from fugitives they managed to trap. They then sequestered those souls in vaults. To motivate their troops, the society guaranteed immortality to each and every SkipHound who sequestered 10,000 fugitive souls. On this cold, blizzardy, Chicago Eve, SkipHound Jonathan Bailey was only 2,357 souls short of that magic number. During hard times, Frankie's mama had sold her soul to the devil. Later, in a fit of desperation, she pledged Frankie's soul. Thus Jonathan Bailey, arguably the finest SkipHound the society had ever trained, trudged, like a fool possessed, toward the tragic spot where Frankie had fallen into the icy lagoon. Just as SkipHound Jonathan Bailey reached the bank of the lagoon, he slipped and fell hard into the soft snow. He hastily picked himself up and quickly shed his overcoat. He secured one end of the long rope around his waist, and hurriedly tied the other end to a sturdy tree. Fearlessly, and without pause, Jonathan crashed through the ice and dug deep into the Arctic lagoon. After a couple of minutes, the legendary SkipHound emerged. He heaved Frankie's lifeless carcass onto the pillory shore. He climbed out, immediately dropped to his knees, and began to press his palms into the boy's back. The water, which filled Frankie's lungs, spouted out from between his clenched gapped teeth. In one fluid motion, Jonathan rolled Frankie over, pinched his nostrils shut, and hovered over him as though ready to perform CPR. All at once, SkipHound Bailey hoarsely strained to blow out every scintilla of his own air. He quickly placed his mouth securely over Frankie's and inhaled deeply, like a high-powered vacuum cleaner. Jonathan Bailey swiftly sucked the God-given spirit from Frankie's immature body. As he had done 7,643 times before, SkipHound Jonathan Bailey strained to force his victim's soul deep into the bowels of his system. Frankie's innocent soul fought to be released. The boy had made no deal with the devil. He hadn't sold his soul to Satan. Why should he suffer for his mama's slithering indiscretion? SkipHound Jonathan Bailey's body quivered as the conflict raged inside. His watery bloodshot eyes bulged. All at once, it appeared as though he were about to vomit. His jaws puffed as he struggled to control the violent convulsions. He placed one hand securely over his crystallized mustache, and firmly held his mouth shut. In spite of the freezing temperature, he had begun to perspire profusely. Soon, the grim SkipHound's contorted face relaxed. He trembled noticeably as he warily removed his hand from his mouth. Jonathan's leathery eyelids slid down as he threw his head back and breathed a sigh of relief. The snowflakes hissed and sizzled as they melted on his face. While Frankie's empty soulless shell incubated in the snow, SkipHound Jonathan Bailey collected his overcoat and rope. Exhausted, he stumbled back to the rusty old truck and drove away. At first opportunity, Jonathan placed an anonymous call to a telephone company operator and provided her with information that led paramedics to the enigmatic scene. During the ambulance ride to the hospital, Frankie suddenly coughed. His forsaken eyes popped wide open. Just like the other victims of the Jackson Park Lagoon, Frankie survived. By 7 o'clock that evening, the anonymous caller was proclaimed to be a hero. Chapter 1. Monday, August 5, 2002, 7:03 p.m. The mood throughout Chicago City Hall was pensive. Key members of Mayor David Williams' staff frantically scurried in and out of his fifth-floor office. Frustration showed on their faces. All desperately wanted to defuse this situation. It had the potential for devastation greater than anything ever faced by any modern American city. This crisis arose when internet rumors suggested that Lucifer himself would preside over the secret society of Satan's mass induction ceremony. Although the exact time and location was undisclosed, it was clear that this vile meeting would definitely take place somewhere in Chicago, sometime within the next few days. Forget the fact that the part concerning Lucifer was baseless. People were reacting to it as though it were real. So fear, with the potential to spur anarchy, threatened to turn the city into an ugly, ugly place. Earlier, the mayor appealed to all government employees to help avert this looming catastrophe, as corny as it may seem, for the sake of all humanity. Startlingly, the mayor's direct phone line rang. It unnerved everyone in the crowded office. They all froze in place. Everyone ceased talking. The tension was as thick as curd. All eyes focused upon the mayor as he circumspectly picked up the handset.
Hello.
Hello, Mayor. This is Edward Wilson, editor of the Chicago Journal.
It was the call the mayor had been waiting for. All of the other media concerns, including USA Today and CNN, had agreed to exclude from their news reports any mention of the rumor that Lucifer would be present at the purported induction ceremony. The Journal was the only major media outlet that had not yet agreed.
Ed, hold on just a moment, please.
The mayor apprehensively covered the mouthpiece with one hand. With 3 or 4 deliberate waves of his other hand, he directed everyone to leave the office except his chief of staff, press secretary, and superintendent of police. Once the departing staffers had closed the door behind them, the mayor took in a deep, uneasy breath. He pushed the red button on the speakerphone and returned the handset to its cradle.
Okay, Ed, we're here.
The speakerphone boomed.
Well, the meeting of our editorial board just ended. We elected to go easy on the Secret Society of Satan story, just as you requested. Our piece on their alleged ceremony will not include any speculation concerning the rumors that Lucifer is supposed to show up.
There was a stifled, jubilant celebration among the mayor's select staff members.
Mind you, it wasn't easy to convince a room full of journalists to hold back. This could turn out to be the biggest news story in history.
Thanks, Ed. Doomsayers are already on the internet insisting that this is the end of the world. At this very moment. Tattooed devil worshippers and sign-carrying Jesus freaks are arriving in Chicago, from all over. Increasingly, the situation is becoming chaotic. Heaven forbid what would have happened if your paper had given credence to the Lucifer rumor. People might have panicked and begun to riot and loot. We would not have had enough time or the opportunity to put our emergency plan into full effect. Things easily could have gotten out of control.
Mayor, this ceremony thing has disaster written all over it. It's bad enough that the society is holding an induction ceremony in your city. However, to make matters worse, the Strategic Alliance to Preserve Souls will likely show up. When that happens, you could have an all-out war on your hands. I don't know how familiar you are with these two groups, but theirs is a history of intense violent clashes and bloodshed. They're sworn enemies that hate each other. They will stop at nothing to destroy one another. When their paths cross, it's just a matter of time before all hell breaks loose.
To be honest with you, Ed, until last week, I had never heard of either of these groups. But, over the last few days I've taken a crash course. Now I'm pretty much up to speed. In a nutshell, P&T, a company that sells lots of soap and paper products, funds the Secret Society of Satan. The Vatican funds the Strategic Alliance to Preserve Souls, affectionately known by the acronym SAPS. Both organizations are run by zealots and hardliners, who've taken the age-old battle for souls to another level.
Yep, that about sums it up. One of our reporters spent years undercover and has developed a pretty extensive file on both the Society and SAPS. They're not like the CIA and the KGB, a bunch of guys paid to sneak around doing polite spy versus spy stuff. These fanatics are insane. Apparently this secret society of Satan does a lot of heavy ritual stuff, including human sacrifices and soul snatching.
Editor Wilson, this is Police Superintendent James Hubbard. I've heard that the Society and SAPS have skirmishes that make the conflict in Kosovo look like a schoolyard fight.
That's true, Jim. According to our sources, all of whom have proven to be reliable in the past, Chicago will likely be their next battleground.
In less than 6 minutes, the mayor looked like he had aged 10 years. With a pained look of utter frustration, he said, "The main problem is, members of these groups are not easily identifiable. They don't wear uniforms. They don't wear their passion on their sleeves or even speak of their affiliation. They are our relatives, our friends, and neighbors, just ordinary people, willing to fight to the death for what they believe.
Mr. Mayor, all I can tell you is this is a no-win situation. Hope for the best, but brace for the worst. And may God help you.
Chapter 2. Monday, August 5, 2002, 7:11 p.m. High above the streets of the Windy City, a slight balmy August breeze entered an open office window. Each puff of air gently amused the noisy vertical blinds. They rhythmically swayed in and out and in. A few feet away, Peter Teller, Senior Vice President of Raft Foods, sat behind an ultra-modern acrylic desk. Through rimless reading glasses, he perused a highly confidential inter-office memorandum. The barely scuffed soles of his brown alligator shoes rested under the contoured desk, on a plush green area rug. In front of the desk, were two side chairs with wooden armrests. One chair was turned at an angle. The fresh indentation in its green leather seat cushion was slowly disappearing. Peter completed his reading. He swiveled around in his high-back leather chair, reached down, and stuffed the memo into the open floor safe, past a fully loaded semi-automatic pistol. He slammed the safe door shut and gave the combination dial a freewheeling spin. As Peter swiveled back around, he reached up, removed his glasses, and placed them on the desk. He rubbed his weary eyes and then securely positioned his elbow on the leather armrest. He glanced up at his cream-colored suit jacket. It quietly hung from a hook on the back of the door. To stretch his neck muscles, Peter rolled his head from east to west. He stopped to consult the marble-faced clock on the wall. It was only 7:15 p.m. His tired body argued it was much later than that. Monday, 7:18 p.m. Chatters worldwide were burning up the internet discussing intriguing rumors of the induction ceremony to be conducted by the Secret Society of Satan. There was a lot of speculation concerning the exact Chicagoland location. Although most chatters were skeptical of claims that Lucifer would appear, some believed that there was a strong possibility he might. Overall, there was fear in the chat rooms. Monday, 7:20 p.m. From the adjoining office suite, Peter's personal assistant, Vanessa Bailey, gave the door a gentle push. The other staff members had long since left for the day. Vanessa volunteered to remain behind to help Peter prepare for his presentation at tomorrow's board meeting. She dutifully re-entered the room and left the door just slightly ajar. His suit jacket slowly swung back and forth, back and forth. Vanessa was a complete package whose very personable aura warmed Peter all over. She was intelligent, faithful, loyal, and above all else, strikingly beautiful. When speaking to close friends in the strictest of confidence, he credited her with being the sexiest woman on the face of the earth, bar none. Ever since they'd first met, Peter was convinced that Vanessa was his soulmate. He knew she was placed on earth for him to love. Try as he might, he couldn't get her out of his mind. Even as Vanessa strolled across the room, he sifted through papers, coyly pretending not to notice her. Yet, all the while, his imagination ran unbridled and unchecked. He envisioned all of the outrageous things he would do, just to satisfy her every sensual craving. As the pristine object of his desire glided into her seat, her white linen skirt showed obvious signs of stress at the point where her hips curved boldly. Her long, sexy legs slid, endlessly, from beneath her hemline. Arguably, her skirt was too short for an office environment. In fact, it ended almost as soon as it began. Peter was moved to murmur beneath his breath, "Thank God for little things." Vanessa wore a bright red camisole. That skimpy little doodad was immaculately tailored out of the finest silk. It hugged her body and accentuated her full breast, which stood at attention, like toy soldiers. There was a bit of perspiration at the point where her nipples protruded through the thin material. The moisture made those erotic little treasures faintly visible. She leaned forward to retrieve her notepad and pen from the desk. The buttons cascading down the front of her camisole appeared to be ready to pop. Peter exercised restraint and discretion, as he spied an anxious anticipation. Vanessa's thick dark brown hair fell softly off of her copper-colored shoulders. Several strands became entangled in the spaghetti straps that held her top in place. She reached across her body, and with a single stroke of her long slender fingers, swept her hair free. The polish on her well-manicured nails glistened in the light. A flawless 3-carat diamond, meticulously set in a shiny platinum wedding band, adorned the ring finger of her left hand. Because Peter had respect for the institution of marriage, he considered Vanessa untouchable. Monday, 7:25 p.m. On a transformed airfield somewhere in Kansas, a meeting of the Strategic Alliance to Preserve Souls was called to order. The Supreme Council of this powerful resistance group had gathered to consider authorizing a drastic mission. It was an aggressive initiative to wipe out the leadership of the secret society of Satan and prevent their long-awaited induction ceremony. This matter was critical. If this ceremony were to take place in Chicago, as planned, desperate parents would pledge the souls of their children to Satan. The souls of those innocent children would be damned forever. The Supreme Council was meeting in SAP's cavernous war room. There was an elaborate network of catwalks suspended high above the floor. SAP's operatives were seated thereupon, at desks positioned theater style. Anchored to the catwalk that spanned across the very front of the war room was a horseshoe-shaped dais, made of Italian marble. That huge slab was a gift from the Pope. SAP's preeminent leader, Commander Odie, was presiding. He was seated at the head of the dais, flanked by 8 uniformed council members, looking out at an elite cadre of operatives. Make no mistake about it, Odie was the head of one of the most powerful legislative bodies on the face of the earth. Monday, 7:33 p.m. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Vanessa and Peter continued their work. She smiled at him. He had no idea why, or what she may have meant by it. But he politely smiled back. To avoid staring at her, he returned to shuffling through his papers. Vanessa had worked for Raft Foods for slightly more than 5 years. She didn't work to pay bills. Her husband, Cyrus Bailey, was steeped in old money. When it came to material things, he gave her everything she could want, even before she could ask for it. She insisted on working simply to avoid going stir-crazy, alone inside that palatial estate in Northbrook, Illinois, an affluent Chicago suburb. Vanessa understood that her husband's work required him to travel constantly. Cyrus was often gone for months on end. She could count the number of nights he stayed in that estate. They were few and far between. Rare was the occasion when Cyrus was in town. For all practical purposes, it was her home, and her home alone. It made little sense for Vanessa to refer to it as theirs. Cyrus' name wasn't even on the deed. Actually, every utility bill, every single thing they owned was in Vanessa's name. It was as if Cyrus didn't even exist. Cyrus didn't mind that Vanessa worked a dead-end job at Raft Foods. As a matter of fact, he wouldn't have it any other way. She had this dream to someday become a freelance writer of magazine articles. Cyrus forbade her from pursuing anything of the sort. He was afraid that if she followed her dream, and realized her full potential, she'd become independent. Having an independent wife wasn't part of Cyrus' plan. He kept Vanessa on a short leash. He made it crystal clear that as long as she lived in that comfortable house in Northbrook, it was his way or no way at all. Their marriage was quite surreal. Cyrus made it his business to know everything there was to know about Vanessa. On the other hand, one would be surprised to discover how very little she actually knew about him. Although she was relatively certain his work had something to do with high finance, Vanessa wasn't exactly sure what Cyrus actually did. She didn't ask any questions and he didn't volunteer any information. Cyrus was lord and master of all he surveyed. He was the quintessential mystery man. Despite having worked with Vanessa for so many years, Peter had only seen her husband on 3 separate occasions. He didn't trust him. He once remarked that Cyrus looked like a deacon who had just embezzled money from the church building fund. Monday, 7:36 p.m. Harry Knott's head wobbled loosely as the Metro commuter train noisily doddered along the girded tracks. He was on his way downtown Chicago, to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He worked there as a night shift security guard. 2 years before he had walked away from that very same job. Fortunately, his former supervisor was willing to give him another chance. Harry had been back at work now 4 months to the day and, boy oh boy, was he ever thankful. Ever since his wife, Catherine, found it in her heart to let him return home, things were looking up. When Harry first met Catherine, she was a 38-year-old nurse. She had a soft heart and a solid gold personality. She was loving, kind and compassionate. Back in those days, Catherine was so beautiful that she was often mistaken for a fashion model. From the start, sex between them was incredibly hot and regular. They dated for a short time and then moved together, into an expensive downtown apartment complex. 7 months later, they married, for better or for worse, in an elegant outdoor ceremony. Famous singer-songwriter Carrie Banilow, Catherine's distant cousin on her mother's side, came and serenaded them with his Grammy Award-winning love ballad. For 18 years, they struggled to maintain a fast-lane lifestyle. Admittedly, beyond their means. They were victimized by the 3 most common marital problems: too many bills, too little money, and one house with 2 stubborn heads of household. Apparently, the pressure was too much for Catherine. She suffered a stroke in 1999. As a result, the left side of her face was partially paralyzed. She was incapacitated and unable to work. Throughout Catherine's extended recuperation period, Harry was forced into the unenviable position of sole provider. He worked day and night, attempting to keep things afloat. Eventually, that pressure overwhelmed him. One dark night, befriended by a bunch of ne'er-do-wells, Harry hung out on a seedy street corner and drank cheap wine until he was drunker than drunk. That night turned into the next day, and yada, yada, yada. Harry became a pitiful wino. He spent the next 10 months aimlessly drifting through the mean streets of Chicago. During that period of his life, he was always drunk or begging for money to buy a drink, so that he could get drunk. Eventually, God and the paramedics in that order found Harry. He was malnourished and at the end of his rope, hanging on by a thread. They rescued him in the nick of time. Harry went through detox and promised to stay clean. He returned to Catherine. She had been waiting for him. She loved him, unconditionally, for better or for worse. Monday, 7:38 p.m. Peter peeked over his reading glasses past the paper he pretended to be reading. He focused his alluring eyes upon Vanessa. He was careful not to let her see him staring. The last thing he ever wanted was to make her feel uncomfortable. Vanessa never seemed to be happily married. Sure, Cyrus gave her money and material things. But, when it came to the emotional support, which she so desperately needed, he failed to deliver. Cyrus never took the time to address her real needs. Peter couldn't begin to describe how badly he desired Vanessa. He often fantasized about her. He thought about how different things would be if she were his woman. He would attend to her needs and help her to realize her dreams. But, Vanessa had never expressed any interest in Peter, and he was too much of a gentleman to make the first move. He would never risk doing anything that might jeopardize their professional working relationship. Peter was resigned to the fact that his mad yearning for Vanessa would forever go unfulfilled. Still, as he sat there, he wished she wanted him as badly as he wanted her. Hey, lest there be any confusion, Peter has great respect for the institution of marriage, but a man has a right to dream. Chapter 3. Monday, August 5, 2002. 7:40 p.m. The metro train squealed to a stop at yet another Chicago station. Harry forced his hand onto the seat back before him to brace himself. The doors swished open. Passengers scrambled to get off. An exiting female passenger brushed by Harry and sweetly smiled at him. Maybe she just liked men in security guard uniforms. Or men who carried guns. What else could it have been? Harry sure wasn't much to look at these days. Once upon a time, by most standards, Harry was considered handsome. Sort of Robert Redford-ish. In those days, few women could resist taking a second glance at Harry. He was now 47, and he looked every bit of it. The fact that he was balding didn't help his cause. But, at least he still had full use of all of his limbs, and at last check, nearly all of his teeth, although probably not for long. Covered with yellow tartar, a bit rickety, and laced with gingivitis, they were just a bite of an apple away from falling out. Although Harry was only 15 to 20 pounds overweight, he had a grossly protruding potbelly. Unable to reduce it, he stretched to creatively turn that obvious negative into a positive. He referred to his round belly as the love machine. He boldly boasted that once unleashed in bed, it would shake and gyrate and give a woman the thrill ride of her life. It would be fruitless to ask his wife, Catherine, to co-sign Harry's claims regarding of this so-called love machine, for they hadn't had sex in years. Monday, 7:41 p.m. The SAP's War Room was located in their Kansas Development and Command compound. This chamber would have been completely dark if not for the candy-colored laser light beams emanating from the digital monitor board. That high-tech DMB was one of many interconnected information monitors, strategically situated throughout the SAP's facility. Those assorted colored rays of light traveled from the DMB, situated front and center above the network of War Room catwalks, and warmly fondled General Rishi, one of the most beautiful 30-something Asian American women God ever created. Rishi was there to convince the council to allow her to wreck a Chicago Metro train in order to kill the top leaders of the secret society of Satan. Although, admittedly, the mission was dangerous, the opportunity was pregnant. Society leaders were rarely together and never, ever, this vulnerable. Monday, 7:42 p.m. Caressed by the seductive gentle breeze flowing through his office window, and intoxicated by Vanessa's beauty, Peter sat entranced. Vanessa looked up just in time to catch him staring at her. With the awkwardness of a visit to her mother-in-law's gynecologist, she said to him,
There's something I feel I must share with you, but I don't know where to begin.
Vanessa, we've worked together for years, and have always been straight with one another. Feel free to say whatever's on your mind.
The fact that we work together is exactly what makes this so difficult. Discussing this sensitive matter with you may damage our incredibly good working relationship. On the other hand, I have to confide in someone and, rightfully, that someone should be you. Does that make sense?
Peter looked puzzled. He gently suggested, "All right, for a moment, forget that we work together and just talk to me, friend to friend."
But, this could change things between us. From this point forward, you may look at me differently.
Vanessa, sometimes change is for the better. I seriously doubt that there is anything you could do or say to diminish my high opinion of you. Thoughtfully, she sat. Silently, she contemplated. After a few seconds, Peter reassuringly said, "Hey, my friend, just say what's on your mind."
Here goes nothing.
Vanessa paused, and then blurted out,
Peter, a few weeks ago, my husband accused me of seeing you. Of having an affair with you.
"What? That's ridiculous. Our relationship has always been strictly professional."
That's what I told him. I tried to convince him that I was not the least bit interested in you.
Upon hearing that, Peter's heart cracked. Fighting gallantly to mask his disappointment, he said, "Well, at least you were able to tell him the truth and clear the air, once and for all."
He didn't believe me.
"What do you mean, he didn't believe you?"
I wasn't surprised. Cyrus always seems to know when I'm lying.
"Really? You were lying?" Surprised, yet indemnified and reassured, Peter responded, "That's not good. Not the fact that you were lying, but that Cyrus was able to tell you were lying."
I swore that nothing had happened between you and me. Not as much as a simple kiss. I don't know why I didn't just stop there. I went on and confessed that for years I have longed to be held by you. To make love to you. Peter, I felt relieved to get that off my chest. I guess confession really is good for the soul.
"Well, Vanessa, if it means anything, likewise, I have a compelling desire to be with you." At that moment, Peter didn't have to guess. In fact, he knew confession was good for the soul. He was relieved to finally let the truth be known. "What are you going to do about it?"
About what?
"The situation with your husband. Have you talked to him about it since?"
Oh, that. I tried, but Cyrus Bailey is a very mean and evil man.
She unconsciously twirled her wedding ring around and around her finger.
I brought the subject up again this past weekend. Thought he'd had time to cool off.
"How did it go?"
I began by trying to assure him that I love him. And I do. He said if I loved him I wouldn't have broken his heart. He yelled, and said the only thing left to discuss was my leaving. I reminded him that everything we own is in my name. Looking back, that was a big mistake. He became enraged, and swore I'd never live to spend one penny of his money, or enjoy the fruits of his labor.
Peter looked at her startled. "That's a pretty strong statement." He then probed. "Do you think he meant it? Was it from the heart? Or was that just his macho pride talking?"
Had you seen the venomous look on his face, you would know he meant every word of it. Cyrus actually backed me into a corner, raised his hand, and threatened to hit me.
"Vanessa, what brought all of this on in the first place? You know as well as I that accusations like this don't just fall out of the sky."
Well, Cyrus is never around. I've suspected for quite a while that he's leading a double life. Or that he's involved with someone else. We haven't been intimate in God knows how long. I sense he wants out of this marriage, so he can be with her. I confronted him. One thing led to another, and Peter, I never thought, not in a million years, that he would stoop to this. Accusing me of messing around, just to hide his own dirt. I've been totally faithful.
"What are you going to do?" Vanessa hopelessly shrugged her shoulders.
I'm not sure.
Peter thoughtfully asked, "Is there anything I can do to help?"
I wish there were. I'm so afraid he'll make good on his threat to kill me, just to avoid paying alimony. And kill you. Just because.
Monday 7:45 p.m. Although ingenious, Rishi's elaborate plan to kill several secret Society of Satan leaders had a huge downside. It involved putting hundreds of Chicago Metro passengers at risk. To rationalize it, and justify this level of civilian endangerment, she presented to the council, and others in the war room, a three-dimensional documentary featuring SAP's faithful who courageously made the ultimate sacrifice in the struggle against the secret society of Satan. All eyes were glued to the virtual images of SAP's dearly departed formed by the laser light beams which spewed forth from the high-tech DMB. These lifelike images walking, talking holograms appeared so convincingly real. It was as if the deceased were actually alive inside the war room. Rishi was emotionally overwhelmed by her own graphic tribute. Tears streamed down her face, as she sat motionless upon her war room throne. Monday, 7:46 p.m. Peter sat stunned as Vanessa sobbed, uncontrollably. She then blurted out,
I'm so scared.
Although she was obviously in need of comforting, he was afraid to move closer. He feared one thing might lead to another and end in romance, as it often does in the movies and novels. Vanessa vulnerably pleaded,
Hold me, Peter. I need to feel your arms around me.
The pure helplessness that resonated throughout her request made him powerless. The moment he had always longed for had come, and he was hesitating like a Duncan yo-yo. He offered a lame excuse. As much as I want to, this is such an inopportune time. In reality, he simply could not muster the gall to move towards her. Instead, he hid behind a look of unassuming shyness. Even as Peter's heart raced like a quarter horse, he sought to reason with her. Vanessa, don't get me wrong. I know this is a difficult time for you. My first impulse is to hold you tightly. I want so very much to hold you and never let you go. But given everything you've told me, and given the way we obviously feel about one another, it's probably best if we call it a night. She pitifully replied,
I was afraid that if I opened up to you, you might reject me.
I'm not rejecting you. I just don't want to take unfair advantage of you.
Peter, in all of my life, no one has ever taken advantage of me. If anything, I'd be taking advantage of you.
Monday, 7:48 p.m. Several Chicago Metro passengers had boarded and the doors were closed behind them. Once again, the commuter train chugged down the tracks. Harry fiddled with his security guard badge and thought about the last time he and Catherine had sex. It was the Friday morning of her unfortunate stroke. He remembered it as a remarkably intense interlude. For months, both of them had been besieged by their hectic schedules. Things had deteriorated to the point where they rarely had time for one another. That particular day they happened to collide in the vestibule, near their front door. She was coming and he was going, or vice versa. One nostalgic glance led to a French kiss and they both got hot. Before you know it, Harry's pants were down around his ankles, Catherine's skirt was hiked up in the air. They were going at it like rabbits. Although it was a quickie, it was the best sex they had ever shared. They promised to continue later. However, fate cruelly intervened. Monday, 7:49 p.m. Upon the conclusion of her lifelike holographic memorial presentation, which virtually resurrected the deceased SAP's faithful, Rishi fought to stifle her tears. She rose before the council.
In closing, let me say, I often think of all of these friends we've lost along the way.
Her voice cracked as she choked back tears.
How they surrendered their lives in the ongoing battle to defeat the society.
Rishi struggled to compose herself and finish.
Those courageous warriors made the ultimate sacrifice. They unselfishly laid down their lives in furtherance of our quest to prevent ignorant parents from ceremoniously pledging the souls of innocent children.
Rishi looked at her watch. It was 7:50 p.m. This massive mission was designed to be rolled out in several phases. Each phase was critical to the success of the mission. Phase 1 involved the planning of explosives, positioning of SAP's operatives, and other top-secret preparation. The preliminary activities, alone, required significant lead time. The computer geeks down in SAP's Interactive Data and Communications Center had developed a strict timeline. They established 11 p.m. as the absolute deadline for initiation of Phase 1. According to the IDCC, if Rishi's mission was not underway by then, it certainly could never begin. With time ticking away, Rishi spoke hurriedly.
For several decades, we have waged war against the society. They have always had more money, better equipment, and more powerful weapons. Although we always fought the good fight, no matter how you define winning, they have always prevailed.
Rishi passionately concluded.
If we don't stop this sinister induction ceremony, The lives of thousands of innocent children will be destroyed. Their futures will be mortgaged and, ultimately, Satan will take their souls to hell. If we allow this to happen, all of our friends will have died in vain. Please, Honorable Council, I beg of you, give us a chance to cripple the society in a way we never have before.
Chapter 4. Monday, August 5, 2002, 7:51 p.m. Vanessa had expressed to Peter her desire for him, and she did not intend to be denied. She leaned across the desk and, in the blink of a mascara-tainted teary eye, firmly grasped his tie. She stared deep into his soul. With a firm tug, she started him forward. He dithered and insincerely suggested, "This may not be the right thing to do. Why don't we take a moment and consider the totality of the situation?" She replied,
I already have. I've decided, if Cyrus is going to treat me like a criminal, I might as well commit the crime.
Undaunted by Peter's feeble resistance, Vanessa tugged harder at his tie, pulling him closer and closer, until her lips met his. Instantly, the chemistry that flowed between them was wonderful. Peter quickly rushed around the desk and whisked Vanessa back in the chair. He bit down on his lip as he slowly shook his head. He glared longingly into her beautiful face. She nodded her head, up and down, urging him to continue. As he drew closer, Vanessa flung her left leg over one armrest and in the same motion, turned and arched her back over the other. She tilted her head back, as far as it would go. The leather seat cushion squealed as she slid downward. He pressed his palms into her shoulders and firmly pinned her in place. She whispered,
Take me, Peter. Do what you want with me.
Peter knelt down next to Vanessa and, ever so deliberately, began to stroke the calf of her leg. He slowly worked his hand up past her knee. She moaned as he caressed her tenderly, alternating from inner thigh to inner thigh. Before long, he clawed desperately at her stingy thong. Peter clumsily pulled and tugged, trying to remove her camisole. With her assistance, he finally managed to raise it over her head. He flung it to the floor. Lingeringly, he stared at her perky breast. He found these comely fleshly mounds truly delightful to behold. He leaned over and pressed his face into Vanessa's warm stomach, guided by the fresh scent of her perfume. Poisoned by Yves Saint Laurent. He followed his nose, and nuzzled his face upwards. Peter tenderly explored her warm body in search of erogenous zones. He didn't have to wonder. Every time he hit Peter, her verbal affirmations were unmistakable and clear. Monday, 7:53 p.m. If you were to simply listen to Harry, you would think Catherine was extremely old. In fact, she was only 58, which really isn't that old at all. But, in all fairness to the truth, she hadn't aged well. Over the years, her face had become one big wrinkle. The stroke left her hunched over and her speech slurred. Catherine looked funny, walked funny, talked funny. As she moved about during the night, her plagued bones creaked loudly, and made creepy noises that resounded and made their house seem haunted. Harry, who, by the way, was 11 years younger, spoke of Catherine as though she were ancient. Like she was a walking, talking mummy. With cobwebs hanging from her tired, sticky old bones. He was afraid to touch her dry, wrinkled, pasty white skin. He feared it would peel off in his hands, allowing maggots to creep out from within. No matter how disgusting Catherine's physical appearance may have been, Harry needed her. He needed her like a child needs a mother. She was stable and reassuring. She was a safe port during the aftermath of the most challenging storm of his life. Monday, 8:03 p.m. A man tentatively identified as James Tunney of Boston, a family man by preliminary accounts, was in a Chicago police interrogation room. He was naked except for his bloody boxer shorts. The rest of his bloody clothes were squished inside an evidence bag in the nearby police lab. Tunney was seated against the far wall, upon a long metal bench with his hands cuffed between his bare thighs. As an added precaution, the handcuffs on his wrists were secured through the thick steel rings, permanently welded to that heavy bench. A horde of high-ranking detectives carefully watched. From a relatively safe distance, as a nervous rookie patrolman obliged the detainee's request for a drink of water. They had no idea what he was capable of, and they weren't taking any chances. The detectives were poised to shoot to kill, upon the slightest provocation.
Note from the author.
Now, you must believe me, I would be the last person on earth to encourage police brutality, police misconduct, or vigilantism. Under calm and sober circumstances, I don't ordinarily advocate that paramilitary personnel exercise violence against any human being. As a rule I believe that police should be law-abiding and adhere to proper protocol. But in this case, I think it would probably have been best for all of humanity if each of those detectives had taken out their service pistols and fired multiple shots into each and every one of this man's vital organs, killing him dead. Double dead.
The detainee lifted his head. The disarmed patrolman, careful to remain outside of his restricted reach, stretched and carefully placed the rim of the styrofoam cup to his lips. He tilted it forward. As James Tunney gulped, his narrow protruding Adam's apple repeatedly lumped and unlumped. The attending detective spied intently. Chicago police had responded to an emergency call from Jack's Diner, a greasy spoon, near downtown. When they arrived they found a bloody mess. 11 people were massacred. The man in custody, the alleged James Tunney, was the only survivor. When found he appeared to be delirious. He was soaked in blood but, otherwise, unharmed. The police found a vulgar satanic message scribbled upon the diner wall. It was a frightening, horrible scene to say the least. This was the kind of thing the mayor and his advisors feared would occur when the secret society of Satan came to town. The police had read James Tunney his Miranda rights. He had exercised his option to have a lawyer present during questioning. An ABA pool attorney had been summoned and was on the way. The police were waiting with bated breath to ask several burning questions. The chief question: why would anyone murder and butcher 11 other people and leave you there, alive? James finished his drink of water. The patrolman removed the cup from his lips and, unashamedly, got away as quickly as he possibly could. He fearfully glanced back over his shoulder as he scampered. Monday, 8:06 p.m. Rishi looked regal as she strolled the interconnected catwalk, back to her war room throne. Next the council would listen to the presentation of General Fothard. This flamboyantly gay technocrat was bitterly opposed to Rishi's mission. The council rules of debate allotted both Rishi and Fothard 2.5 hours to present their respective cases. Her total presentation had taken just 52 minutes. It was a safe bet that Fothard would utilize every second of the time afforded him. His strategy was to engage in a filibuster and make it impossible for the Supreme Council to vote on her proposal before the mission launch deadline. The IDCC computer geeks had promised Rishi that they would tweak the mission timeline and attempt to extend the launch deadline by at least a few minutes. If successful, they would post an instant message on the digital monitor board. Rishi had been watching the DMB and, thus far, there had been no such message. She wondered why in the first place SAPS leaders felt the need to hold a hearing to decide something so elementary. Members of SAPS had taken a pledge to do whatever was necessary to stop the society. Therefore, they had an obligation to act to prevent this momentous ceremony. If SAPS went forward and eliminated the society's brain trust, the opposition probably couldn't regroup or recover to convene another ceremony for several years. There was no doubt in Rishi's mind that this action was necessary to protect the souls of the innocent children who were unequivocally at risk. Monday, 8:10 p.m. Peter forcefully pressed Vanessa's right shoulder into the wooden armrest of the office chair. She loved it. He relentlessly peppered her neck and collarbone with long acute kisses. That action seemed to drive her wild. Vanessa moaned more loudly than before. Her rapid breathing became heavier and heavier. Neither of them had ever been in a higher state of arousal. Their passion intensified. Vanessa took her right hand and firmly grasped the back of Peter's head. She dug her fingernails into his scalp. Unaccustomed to being dominated by a woman, he offered token resistance. They briefly struggled. She prevailed. She pulled his face past hers and stuck her hot wet tongue into his ear. Peter lost all will to resist. He wondered if he had died and gone to heaven. She pulled his head upwards until their lips were reunited. They kissed wildly and passionately. She sucked on his face like a frenzied savage. When he pulled away, her blood-red lipstick was smeared all over his face and chin. Vanessa quickly forced his lips back down to her shoulder. He nibbled on her neck, as she persistently tugged at the crotch of his pants. She pleaded,
Bite harder.
Peter obliged, and sank his teeth deep into the nape of her neck. She panted and moaned louder than ever. With the agility of a contortionist, she sank deeper into the chair. Vanessa proved to be even sexier and more exciting than Peter had ever imagined. She frantically pawed and slapped at his chest. She grabbed hold of the front of his shirt. It was wet from perspiration. She snarled like a tiger and yanked. The shirt ripped open. The ivory white buttons tumbled, end over end, until they hit the floor. Peter watched in slow motion. As they bounced, scattered and rattled to a stop on the parquet floor, near the edge of the plush green rug. The two were consumed in fiery passion, and all reserve was lost. They interacted freely, lustfully, desperately. At times, quasi-violently, events began to unfold too rapidly for words. Finally, they crossed the line, beyond the point of no return. Monday 8:12 p.m. General Fatard leisurely sashayed along the catwalk, high above Sap's war room floor. He was superbly attired in a baggy suit, artfully designed to hide his portly physique. His white silk slacks and knee-length jacket flowed and accentuated his exaggerated feminine gestures. As the DMB's multicolored light beams danced off of him, his puffy bleached blonde hair appeared to constantly change hue. Fatard looked like the cowardly lion caught in a kaleidoscope. Sap's Supreme Council waited patiently for the start of his presentation. Finally, he began with a bold promise.
Distinguished members of the Council, I will make it clear, beyond a phantom of a doubt, that Rishi's plan to wreck a Chicago Metra commuter train in an attempt to kill 7 society leaders is foolish, reckless, and will not serve the intended purpose.
He then began to elaborate. Fatard knew that time was his friend, so he spoke slowly and deliberately. He figured that by the time his 2.5 hours were up, the members of the Supreme Council would take a short recess. After the recess, they would ask questions. They might privately discuss the matter, for as long as 10 minutes, take at least 5 minutes to vote, and another few minutes to reconsider the vote. And voila, they would be beyond the deadline. General Fatard didn't plan to quit his filibuster until it was too late for Rishi to begin her mission. He wanted to see this case closed. He planned to see her window of opportunity slammed shut, like the loud heavy steel door to a jail cell. Rishi angrily realized that time was not on her side. Yet, she was helpless. There was nothing she could do to limit the length of Fatard's presentation, and there was nothing she could do to alter the impending time deadline. Rishi could only hope the IDCC geeks might find a way to extend it. As 0 hour loomed closer, the emptiness in the pit of her stomach ached more and more. Monday 8:15 p.m. In the afterglow of their amorous interlude, Peter and Vanessa lay carnally entangled on the plush green rug. He heard a sound and alertly snatched his lips away from hers. He froze as still as a department store mannequin. His heart lodged in his throat. A feeling of acute emptiness burned in his chest. He attempted to swallow, but he could not. Like an erect guard dog sensing danger, Peter perched motionless and listened breathlessly. His head twisted purposefully. His scared eyes shifted from side to side. He harvested his senses and carefully surveyed his surroundings. At that moment, Peter became mortally aware of his vulnerability. He prayed Vanessa's husband, Sirius, hadn't come to make good on his threats. Although lightheaded, Peter struggled to keep his eyes focused upon the slightly cracked door. His hands trembled and his palms began to sweat. The tension shot pain to his neck and shoulders. He ached with panic and fear. The mounting apprehension of an unwarranted, untimely intrusion was too much to bear. He was going for the gun he kept in the safe. He nervously placed one hand on the floor for leverage, and slowly began to rise. By now, Vanessa had opened her eyes. Peter glanced down at her and then back at the door. Her eyes followed his. His suit jacket hung motionless. She anxiously asked,
"What's the matter?"
When he failed to respond, she asked more demandingly,
"Peter, what's going on?"
"Shish," he snapped, unable to take his fearful eyes off of the door. The room was completely silent. After a moment, which seemed like an eternity, a gentle breeze entered the open window and blew a sheet of paper from a pile on the desk. It floated gracefully and landed on the floor with a substantial crackle. There was another sheet of paper on the floor nearby. Peter quickly deduced that the paper was the source of the sound which concerned him. His whole body went limp, as he thankfully sighed in relief. His heart eased back down into his chest and began to beat again. He took several prolonged breaths and attempted to regain his composure. Somewhat embarrassed, Peter offered his lustful willing companion a shoulder shrug. With a partially open palm that led to an outstretched pointer finger, he motioned towards the paper on the floor. Vanessa understood his silent, impotent explanation, but she did not bother to respond. Unaffected by this momentary distraction, they returned to the edge of extreme eroticism. The two of them enjoyed mauling one another. Once again, they were lost in lust and oblivious to their surroundings. Monday 8:23 p.m. During the first few months following his return home, Harry didn't get much sleep. Catherine rode him like a witch riding a broom. Day and night, she nagged him to have sex with her. She tried every non-alcoholic enticement known to mankind, including candlelight, soft music, and sexy lingerie. There was absolutely nothing she could do to arouse him. Catherine didn't want to admit it, but deep down inside she knew that Harry refused to make love to her because he was completely repulsed by her appearance. Still, she wouldn't let him off the hook. Finally, she accused Harry of cheating with another woman. Her incessant nagging was worse than Chinese water torture. Desperate for a full night of sleep, Harry lied, and told Catherine that he had previously seen a doctor and had been found to be sexually dysfunctional. He thought that would be the end of it. However, Catherine suggested he see a specialist. She rationalized, if they could fix Bob Dole's wee-wee, surely they could help you get it up. Harry agreed to see a doctor. Catherine insisted on attending the initial consultation. In her presence, as best as he could, Harry described the situation to the specialist. Seeing Catherine, the doctor immediately understood Harry's dilemma. Man to man, he understood. For the sake of argument, the specialist conducted a thorough exam. He then compassionately confirmed that Harry was hopelessly sexually dysfunctional. He somberly explained that neither Viagra, nor any surgical procedure could remedy his problem. It's hopeless, the doctor told Catherine, with a pat on the back. Hopeless. Truth is, in an odd sort of way, Catherine was relieved by the doctor's diagnosis. After hearing it for herself, she stopped questioning her own worth as a woman. Instead, from that day forth, she told everyone who would listen about Harry's problem. Talking about it made her feel better. Harry had mixed emotions about Catherine discussing his personal business with others. The downside was that everyone she confided in looked upon him as only half a man. The upside was Catherine had stopped nagging him to have sex. She also stopped accusing him of being unfaithful. Harry took the bitter with the sweet. Thereafter, Harry slept well, albeit everyone in his dreams snickered as they passed him by. Monday, 8:31 p.m. General Rishi sat stoic, with her anxious brown eyes glued to the digital master board. It flickered and changed faster than she could flutter her long eyelashes. Still, there was no word of that deadline extension that she so desperately prayed for. Fatard stubbornly continued his unmerciful filibuster.
Yes, our mission statement says that we will aid conscientious backsliders and assist those improperly condemned to eternal life in Hades. Oh yes, and protect the souls of innocent children. But there are many ways to accomplish these things. We don't necessarily have to waltz into Chicago and start a battle that might escalate out of control.
His high-pitched voice rang out insincerely.
Sure, our hearts go out to the young people, as well as their misguided parents who are willing to make a deal with the devil to get what they want. Many of them are our family and friends. We so earnestly want to save their souls. After all, that's why most of us join SAPs. But there are limits to what we should and should not do. Violent confrontation isn't always the answer.
Fatard then tried to further minimize the need for Rishi's mission. He cited other means of accomplishing the same things. Yet, everyone in the war room was unconvinced. They knew he was just spewing chicken-hearted rhetoric.
We already do so much in keeping with our pledge. Our Advocate Outreach Division meets troubled people at their point of need. Our crisis intervention case workers provide counseling and help to hide people on the run from the society's SkipHounds.
Fatard continued with a sassy nasal tone.
We have no right to wreck a train full of people simply to kill society leaders on the way to a ceremony. That's insane. No one in their right mind would even suggest that.
Rishi was angry. That silly jerk had made her mission seem ill-conceived and called her crazy, all in one breath. She wanted to snatch off her pantyhose and stuff them in his big fat mouth. But, she knew even that wouldn't shut him up. It was never more apparent how different Fatard and Rishi were. He was educated, she was wise, he was an eternal pessimist, she was a pragmatist, he was a social worker, she was a full-fledged warrior. Fatard was afraid to die. Rishi was afraid to live. If living meant she had to surrender,